There's a family Bible in the Kentucky Historical Society that sits behind locked glass, accessible only to researchers with special permission. The Bible, bound in cracked leather and dated 1842, contains a genealogical record spanning 4 generations of the Whitmore family, one of Lexington's most prominent dynasties. But in 2003, when DNA testing was conducted on descendants claiming connection to this family, something impossible was discovered. The carefully documented lineage the proud family tree maintained across decades was built on a lie so shocking, so completely hidden, that when the truth emerged, it destroyed reputations, erased inheritances, and revealed that 3 generations of wealthy white women had all been intimate with the same enslaved man. And then came the final revelation, the one that transformed scandal into horror. That man was related by blood to the very family he had secretly fathered children into. This is not simply a story about forbidden desire across racial lines. This is a story about incest hidden within already hidden relationships, about a family tree that collapsed into itself, and about how 30 years of deception created a bloodline so tangled that modern descendants cannot trace their true ancestry. Before we begin, please leave a comment with your location and the current time. We want to know how far these stories reach and at what hours people seek out the darkness we document. In the spring of 1842, Eleanor Whitmore became mistress of Ashbrook Plantation, 10 miles outside Lexington, Kentucky. She was 26 years old, recently widowed after her husband, Colonel Thomas Whitmore, died of cholera, leaving her with a 7-year-old daughter named Victoria and a substantial estate to manage. Eleanor was, by all accounts, a striking woman, tall, dark-haired, intelligent, and entirely unprepared for the loneliness that would define her widowhood. Kentucky society in the 1840s was rigid in its expectations. A young widow was expected to mourn appropriately, manage her household with dignity, and eventually remarry a suitable gentleman who could restore male authority to her estate. But Eleanor had discovered during her marriage to the much older Thomas that she preferred independence to male authority. She had no intention of remarrying. What she didn't anticipate was the profound isolation that decision would bring, or the dangerous ways she would eventually try to fill that emptiness. Ashbrook Plantation operated with a workforce of 37 enslaved people. Among them was a man named Gabriel, purchased by Colonel Whitmore in 1838 from an estate sale in Virginia. Gabriel was 22 years old when Eleanor became mistress. Unusually educated for an enslaved man, having been trained as a house servant in a wealthy Virginia household, where he had been taught to read, write, and manage complex household accounts. He was also, according to every account that survives, exceptionally handsome, tall, with light brown skin that suggested mixed ancestry, refined features, and a quiet dignity in his bearing that both attracted attention and made white overseers uncomfortable. Gabriel's origins were deliberately vague in the sale documents. He was listed as approximately 22 years of age, parentage unknown, trained for house service. What those documents didn't reveal, what would only be discovered decades later through fragmented family letters, was that Gabriel's father had been a white plantation owner in Virginia named Jonathan Whitmore, Thomas Whitmore's younger brother. This made Gabriel Thomas Whitmore's nephew. It made him Eleanor's nephew by marriage, and it made him the half-uncle to little Victoria, though no one knew this in 1842 because Jonathan Whitmore had never acknowledged his relationship with Gabriel's enslaved mother, a woman named Sarah who had been sold away when Gabriel was an infant. Gabriel himself knew nothing of his white father. He had been raised knowing only that he was property, that his light skin marked him as the son of some unknown white man, and that such ancestry provided no protection, no rights, no acknowledgement. When Colonel Whitmore purchased Gabriel in 1838, he had no idea he was buying his own brother's child. The secret of Gabriel's parentage existed only in a few private letters Jonathan Whitmore had written to a confidant before his death in 1840, letters that would not surface until the 1890s. So in 1842, when Eleanor Whitmore began to notice the quiet, educated house servant who managed her accounts with impressive competence, she had no idea that the man she was looking at was actually connected to her by blood through her late husband. Their relationship began, as such relationships often did, with small conversations about household matters that gradually became more personal. Eleanor, starved for intellectual companionship, found herself drawn to Gabriel's intelligence and the careful way he spoke, always respectful but with an underlying awareness that suggested he saw more than he was allowed to acknowledge. Gabriel, for his part, recognized the danger in the mistress's attention, but also understood that he had no power to refuse that attention if it became demand rather than interest. By the winter of 1844, Eleanor and Gabriel had become lovers. What began as stolen moments in the plantation office became a regular arrangement. Gabriel would come to Eleanor's private quarters late at night, entering through a servant's passage that allowed him to move unseen. They would spend hours together, and Eleanor, for the first time in her adult life, felt seen and desired by someone who engaged with her as an intellectual equal, despite the monstrous power imbalance that made genuine equality impossible. Eleanor convinced herself that what they shared was real love, that Gabriel's gentle touch and soft words represented genuine feeling rather than the careful survival strategy of an enslaved man who understood that refusing the mistress's desires would likely result in sale, punishment, or worse. Gabriel never expressed his true feelings about the situation because he couldn't. To admit he felt trapped would risk everything. To admit he cared for Eleanor would be to acknowledge vulnerability he couldn't afford. So he remained careful, attentive, giving Eleanor what she wanted while protecting himself as much as any enslaved man in such a position could hope to protect himself. In March of 1847, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. She was 31 years old, had not been seen with any potential suitor, and had no plausible explanation for this pregnancy. In desperation, she concocted a story about a brief, secret relationship with a traveling merchant who had since moved west. Society was scandalized but ultimately accepted the explanation because the alternative, that a respected widow had been intimate with her slave, was too socially destabilizing to seriously consider. In October 1847, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter she named Charlotte. The child had light skin that could pass for white, allowing Eleanor's story to remain unchallenged. Charlotte was raised as a legitimate Whitmore, her true parentage known only to Eleanor and, of course, to Gabriel, who watched his daughter grow up in the main house while he remained enslaved in the quarters, forbidden to acknowledge her, forbidden to claim any connection beyond serving as her mother's property. This arrangement continued for years. Eleanor and Gabriel remained lovers, though the birth of Charlotte had made Eleanor more cautious, more careful about avoiding another pregnancy. Gabriel continued managing the household, his intelligence and competence making him invaluable to Eleanor's successful operation of the plantation. And Charlotte grew into a bright, willful child who had inherited her father's sharp mind and her mother's striking features, though no one except Eleanor saw the resemblance. Victoria Whitmore, Eleanor's daughter from her marriage to Colonel Whitmore, grew to adulthood with all the privilege her position afforded. In 1852, at age 17, she married a wealthy tobacco merchant and moved to a plantation in another county. This left Charlotte, now 5 years old, as the only child at Ashbrook. Charlotte grew up alongside Gabriel's presence in the household. He taught her mathematics and bookkeeping, supervised her education, and occupied a strange middle position in her life. Neither family nor servant in the ways she understood those categories, but someone whose intelligence and attention she came to depend upon. As Charlotte entered her teenage years, she developed an intense attachment to Gabriel that Eleanor initially dismissed as childish admiration. But by the time Charlotte turned 16 in 1863, the nature of that attachment had become unmistakably different. In the privacy of her diary later discovered during the estate settlement in 1889, Charlotte wrote about Gabriel with the language of obsessive romantic love. She described his hands, his voice, the way he moved, the intelligence in his eyes. She wrote about watching him and imagining scenarios that her strict religious education told her were sinful, but that she couldn't stop herself from fantasizing about. In one entry from July 1864, she wrote, "I know it is wrong to feel this way about a servant, about someone mother owns. But I cannot help it. He is the only man I have ever met who sees me as more than decorative property to be married off. He teaches me, speaks to me as though my thoughts matter. I find myself inventing reasons to be near him, to have him teach me something new, anything to keep him close." What Charlotte didn't know, what Eleanor had never told her, was that Gabriel was her father. All Charlotte knew was that she was drawn to him with an intensity that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. In the fall of 1865, shortly after the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, Gabriel remained at Ashbrook, legally free but with nowhere to go and no resources to establish himself elsewhere. He accepted Eleanor's offer of paid employment managing the estate. This arrangement raised some eyebrows in the community but was generally accepted as a practical solution to the labor shortage in the immediate post-war period. Charlotte, now 18 and increasingly bold about her feelings, began actively pursuing Gabriel's attention. She would seek him out in the estate office, asking questions about the accounts but clearly interested in more than bookkeeping. She would find excuses to touch his hand, to stand close to him, to look at him in ways that made Gabriel deeply uncomfortable, because he understood exactly what that look meant and knew that acting on it would be catastrophic. Gabriel went to Eleanor in desperation. "Miss Eleanor," he said. He still called her that despite emancipation. "Charlotte is showing me attention that is inappropriate. I don't know how to discourage her without causing offense or making things worse." Eleanor's response would haunt Gabriel for the rest of his life. After a long silence, she said, "Charlotte is 18 now. She will marry soon, I expect. Until then, if she seeks your company, you will be kind to her. She is lonely as I was lonely when I was her age. She needs someone who sees her intelligence, who treats her as more than a prize to be won. You will provide that companionship, do you understand?" Gabriel understood perfectly. Eleanor was giving him permission, perhaps even an instruction, to become intimate with Charlotte just as he had been with Eleanor. The horror of what Eleanor was suggesting, that he should sleep with both mother and daughter, that he should become intimate with his own daughter whom Charlotte didn't know was his daughter, made Gabriel physically ill. He tried to refuse, tried to explain that he could not, would not do this. Eleanor's response was cold. "You are free now, Gabriel. Free to leave, free to starve, free to try to make your way with no money, no property, and no recommendations from me. Or you can stay, you can continue to have shelter and income and security. The choice is yours." It wasn't a choice, and they both knew it. Gabriel stayed, and in the spring of 1866, Charlotte Whitmore seduced him, or he allowed himself to be seduced by her, or some combination of both that made questions of agency hopelessly tangled. What followed was a relationship that continued for 5 years, during which time Charlotte believed she was in love with Gabriel. Eleanor knew that her daughter was sleeping with the same man Eleanor herself still occasionally slept with, and Gabriel lived in a special kind of hell, knowing that he was being intimate with his own daughter and unable to tell anyone without destroying multiple lives, including his own. In 1871, Charlotte Whitmore married a wealthy merchant from Louisville named Henry Bradford. The marriage was arranged by Eleanor, who recognized that Charlotte's relationship with Gabriel needed to end before it became public knowledge. Charlotte, devastated by having to leave Gabriel, nevertheless obeyed her mother and married Henry Bradford in June 1871. She moved to Louisville with her new husband, and Eleanor hoped that distance would end the dangerous situation that had developed. But Charlotte could not forget Gabriel, and she found excuses to return to Ashbrook frequently. Always when her husband was away on business. These visits inevitably resulted in stolen encounters with Gabriel, and Eleanor, no longer sleeping with Gabriel herself, turned a blind eye to her daughter's continuing affair. Meanwhile, a new complication emerged. Eleanor's mother, Margaret Whitmore, had come to live at Ashbrook after the death of her second husband in 1870. Margaret was 68 years old, a widow twice over, and still handsome with the kind of presence that commanded attention. She had always been somewhat scandalous in her youth, known for a sharp wit and a disregard for proper female behavior that had mellowed only slightly with age. Within months of arriving at Ashbrook, Margaret had noticed Gabriel, and more importantly, had noticed the way both Eleanor and Charlotte looked at him during Charlotte's visits. Being considerably more perceptive than social convention typically allowed elderly women to be, Margaret deduced that something irregular was happening regarding Gabriel and the Whitmore women. What happened next shocked even Eleanor. In the summer of 1872, Margaret Whitmore, at age 70, began her own affair with Gabriel. How this began remains unclear from the surviving documentation, but Eleanor's diary from that period expresses utter horror at the discovery. Mother has taken Gabriel to her bed, my own mother, at her age, with the same man who has been intimate with both myself and Charlotte. I should put a stop to it. I should send Gabriel away, send Mother back to Louisville, put an end to this grotesque situation. But I find I lack the will. I am 56 years old, too tired to fight, too complicit in creating this situation to have any moral authority to end it. So I say nothing, and the madness continues. For the next 6 years, until Margaret's death in 1878, Gabriel was intimate with 3 generations of Whitmore women. Eleanor, intermittently as they had been for over 30 years, Charlotte, whenever she visited from Louisville, and Margaret, regularly as she lived at Ashbrook. The women knew about each other but never discussed it openly, maintaining a strange fiction of ignorance while competing for Gabriel's attention in ways they told themselves were subtle but that made Gabriel's position increasingly untenable. During these years, 4 more children were born connected to Gabriel. Charlotte had 2 more children, 1873 and 1876, that she claimed were her husband Henry's, though both showed features that suggested otherwise. Eleanor's original daughter, Victoria, who had occasionally visited Ashbrook during these years, gave birth to a daughter in 1875 whose light skin and facial structure suggested Gabriel's paternity, though Victoria never admitted to any relationship with him. And most disturbingly, Margaret gave birth to a son in 1874 at age 72, an extremely unusual but not impossible occurrence. A child she claimed was from a liaison with a visitor to the plantation but who looked remarkably like Gabriel. The situation had become so complex, so tangled with lies and willful ignorance, that even the participants had difficulty tracking what was real and what was fiction. Gabriel, now in his late 50s, had fathered children with his daughter Charlotte, herself his daughter with Eleanor, had been intimate with 3 generations of women in the same family, and had no legal claim to any of the 6 or more children he had fathered at Ashbrook. The emotional toll of this sustained deception was devastating. Gabriel developed what would now be recognized as severe depression, though in 1880s Kentucky it was simply noted that he had become increasingly withdrawn and uncommunicative. Eleanor Whitmore died in February 1889 at age 73. In her final days, attended by her daughter Charlotte and her granddaughter, Charlotte's eldest child, Eleanor made a decision that would destroy the family she had built. She confessed everything. She told Charlotte that Gabriel was Charlotte's biological father. She revealed the multi-generational relationships that had occurred. She admitted that Charlotte's children were not Henry Bradford's offspring, but Gabriel's, which made those children the products of incest. Charlotte had unknowingly slept with her own father. The horror of this revelation was too much for Charlotte to process all at once. She tried to deny it, insisted her mother must be hallucinating in her final illness, but Eleanor persisted, providing details that could only come from direct knowledge. When Eleanor died, Charlotte was left with a truth she couldn't unlearn and couldn't share without destroying her own life and her children's futures. Charlotte did what she thought was practical. She buried the truth. She burned her mother's diaries, destroyed what correspondence she could find, and swore the two attendants who had heard Eleanor's confession to secrecy, paying them substantial sums to ensure their silence. Gabriel, now 71 years old and in failing health, was sent away from Ashbrook with a generous pension on the condition that he never contact the family again and never reveal what had occurred. He accepted these terms and disappeared from Lexington entirely. Charlotte returned to Louisville, told her husband nothing of what she had learned, and tried to continue her life as though the foundation beneath it hadn't been completely destroyed. She died in 1907, taking most of the secret with her, though she left one document, a sealed letter to be opened only upon the death of her youngest grandchild, which occurred in 1989, 100 years after Eleanor's confession. That letter, discovered during the settlement of the last direct descendant's estate, revealed the entire history and ignited a scandal that had been dormant for a century. Even more damaging, the letter suggested that Charlotte believed other family members beyond herself had also been intimate with Gabriel, though she hadn't known for certain and had been too horrified to investigate. What followed was a family crisis that spanned 3 states as various branches of the Whitmore descendants realized they might be more closely related than they thought. In 2003, when DNA testing had become relatively affordable and genealogical research had become a popular hobby, several Whitmore descendants decided to use genetic testing to clarify their family connections. The results were shocking. Multiple family lines that believed themselves to be distantly related through various Whitmore marriages were actually half-siblings or closer relations. The testing revealed that Gabriel had fathered children with at least 4 Whitmore women: Eleanor, Charlotte, Victoria, and possibly one of Charlotte's daughters, making the family tree less a tree than a twisted column where the same male genetic material appeared repeatedly across generations that should have had diverse paternity. Most disturbing was the revelation about Charlotte's children. DNA analysis confirmed that Charlotte had indeed been intimate with her biological father, Gabriel, making her 3 children products of incest. These children had married and had their own children, passing down not only Gabriel's genetic material, but also the increased likelihood of genetic abnormalities associated with inbreeding. Modern descendants of this line showed higher than expected rates of certain genetic conditions consistent with incestuous parentage. The scandal exploded in Kentucky newspapers. Prominent family built on incest and deception. DNA testing reveals 150-year secret. Whitmore fortune founded on forbidden relationships. Descendants found themselves facing impossible questions. Were their marriages legal? Some discovered they had unknowingly married close genetic relatives. Were their inheritances legitimate? Some family trusts had been based on lineages now proven false. Were they at genetic risk? Inbreeding from Gabriel's repeated paternity had created a narrower gene pool than anyone had realized. The Whitmore family, once one of Kentucky's most respected dynasties, saw their reputation destroyed. Family members changed their surnames to escape association. Trusts were dissolved. Historical societies removed Whitmore family donations from prominent display. The carefully maintained family Bible, that beautiful leather-bound record of generations, became evidence of lies rather than history. The Kentucky reversal, as it became known, reveals layers of transgression, each more disturbing than the last. It began with a widow's loneliness leading to a relationship with an enslaved man, already a violation of social codes, but perhaps understandable as human connection in inhumane circumstances. But then it became a pattern, mother and daughter sharing the same man, grandmother joining them, Generations of women in one family, all intimate with the same man they had power over. And finally, the ultimate horror. Gabriel had been forced into incest with his own daughter, Charlotte, neither knowing the truth but him carrying the secret of her true paternity. He had fathered children with his daughter, created a genetic tangle that would affect descendants for generations. What makes this story particularly disturbing is the question of agency and responsibility. Gabriel was enslaved when the relationships began, giving him no power to refuse. Even after emancipation, his dependence on Eleanor for survival left him with limited options. Can he be judged for what he was forced to do? Eleanor, Charlotte, Victoria, Margaret, they held all the power in these relationships, but they also lived in a society that gave them few outlets for desire or autonomy. Are they perpetrators or victims of the system that created such twisted dynamics? And what about the children born from these relationships, especially Charlotte's children who were products of incest neither parent knew was occurring? How do we understand their existence? Modern descendants of the Whitmore family still struggle with these questions. Support groups have formed for people discovering through DNA testing that their ancestry includes unexpected incest. Not only from this family, but from similar situations where power imbalances and hidden relationships created genetic tangles across generations. The psychological impact of learning that your great-great-grandmother unknowingly slept with her father, that your family tree is built on a foundation of lies and abuse disguised as romance, cannot be overstated. The Whitmore family Bible sits behind locked glass, not as a treasure but as a warning that families can harbor secrets so destructive that even generations later, the truth cannot be fully recovered or the damage fully undone. Remember this story not for its sensational elements, but for what it reveals about the intersection of power, desire, and deception. About how slavery created conditions where incest could occur without anyone knowing. About how lies compound across generations until the truth becomes literally unknowable. And about how DNA testing in the modern era has begun uncovering secrets that families buried, forcing descendants to reckon with histories they never chose but must now somehow integrate into their understanding of who they are.